The Fifth Crusade, an epic of blood and despair in the early 13th century, as Europe groaned under internal strife and rivalries between kingdoms, a new call echoed from Rome, one that promised glory and salvation. Pope Honorius III, successor to Pope Innocent III, issued a thunderous proclamation that shook the thrones of kings and stirred the hearts of knights and nobles alike. The time has come to reclaim the Holy Land. This was no ordinary summons. It was a desperate cry following a series of disasters that had befallen the Crusaders. The Fourth Crusade, which had gone astray to sack Christian Constantinople instead of liberating Jerusalem, left a deep wound in the conscience of Christendom. Now, the course had to be corrected. In the courts of Europe, kings and lords began preparing for the new mission. Andrew II of Hungary, a man of boundless ambition, was the first to answer the call. He gathered a formidable army of knights and soldiers and began his long march through the Balkans toward the east. Leopold VI of Austria, a seasoned military leader, joined him with his trained troops. From France and Germany, knights hungry for glory flocked to the cause, each carrying in his heart the dream of retaking Jerusalem, yet not all hearts burned with the same fervor. Emperor Frederick II, who was meant to lead the crusade, was embroiled in his conflicts with the papacy and his wars in Italy. Despite promises and threats, he could not join, leaving the campaign without unified leadership. In the streets of European cities, monks urged the people to take up the cross. Whoever joins this holy war shall have all his sins forgiven. This refrain echoed everywhere, from the alleys of Paris to the countryside of England. Impoverished peasants, ambitious merchants, and glory-seeking knights all rallied under the banner of the cross. After months of preparation, armies began gathering in the ports of Italy and Sicily. Ships laden with soldiers and war supplies set sail eastward, toward Acre, the last stronghold of the Crusaders in the east. The city, which had witnessed past victories and defeats, now stood on the brink of another bloody chapter. When the armies arrived in Acre, they found a city suffering under weak Crusader rule. The poor starved, merchants lamented the loss of trade routes, and knights lived on memories of past glories. But the arrival of fresh reinforcements rekindled hope in their hearts. In the Grand Command tent, the Crusader leaders gathered to make a fateful decision: where would they strike next? Jerusalem was the dream, but the lessons of the past had taught them that a direct assault would be futile. Egypt, the heart of Ayyubid power, became the new target. He who controls Egypt controls Jerusalem, declared one commander passionately. Damietta, the Egyptian city on a branch of the Nile, was the gateway to Cairo. Capturing it would sever the lifeline of the Ayyubid state. In the summer of 1218, the Crusader fleet sailed south, carrying thousands of soldiers who did not yet know they were heading toward one of history's bloodiest sieges. When the sails of the Crusader ships appeared on the horizon, alarm bells rang throughout Damietta. The once bustling city transformed into a war zone. The towering fortress at its center seemed to defy the invaders. Men, women, and children rushed to the defenses, each knowing that the city's fall meant death or enslavement. Sultan Al-Kamil, son of Sultan Al-Adil, was in his citadel when news of the invasion reached him. A man in his prime, he possessed wisdom beyond his years. He immediately sent word to his father in Cairo, pleading for reinforcements. But fate had a cruel surprise in store. In August 1218, Al-Adil died, leaving his son a heavy legacy: a brutal war against formidable enemies. Long months passed with the city under siege. The Crusaders dug trenches, built siege engines, and sent wave after wave of soldiers against the walls. The defenders resisted valiantly, but food ran low, and disease spread. One moonlit night, Al-Kamil attempted a surprise night attack, but the bright moon betrayed his movements. After 18 grueling months, Damietta fell. But victory was bitter. The city the Crusaders entered was a ghost town. Corpses littered the streets, houses stood abandoned, and the air reeked of death. Now, the Crusaders stood at a crossroads. Some wanted to march straight to Cairo, while others argued for consolidating their hold on Damietta first. Cardinal Pelagius, the papal legate, was the most vehement. "We must strike now while they are weak." But the military commanders were more cautious. Al-Kamil, regrouping in the south, sent a shocking offer: "I will give you Jerusalem and most of its kingdom if you leave Egypt." The proposal was staggering. Jerusalem, the dream for which thousands had died, was being handed to them on a silver platter. But Cardinal Pelagius angrily refused. Jerusalem without Egypt will not stand. The following summer, the Crusaders finally advanced toward Cairo. But they did not realize they were walking into a trap. Al-Kamil had opened the Nile's floodgates. The rushing waters turned the land into vast swamps. The Crusader army, weighed down by heavy armor and equipment, began sinking into the mud. One night, as the Crusader soldiers tried to sleep in their waterlogged tents, they heard strange noises. Suddenly, Egyptian forces ambushed them from all sides. Arrows rained from the darkness, and cavalry cut off escape routes. Chaos consumed the Crusader camp. After days of desperate fighting, the Crusaders realized they were trapped: no food, no clean water, no way out. Finally, they signed the surrender. Al-Kamil's terms were clear: leave Egypt immediately and return Damietta. On the morning of August 1221, the Crusaders boarded their ships once more, not as victorious conquerors, but as defeated fugitives. Damietta, which had cost them thousands of lives, was back in Muslim hands. In Cairo, the people celebrated victory. Al-Kamil, now the unchallenged sultan, stood on his palace balcony watching the enemy ships retreat. He knew this was not the end. The Crusaders would return, and in Europe, news of the defeat struck like a thunderbolt. Pope Honorius III, who had been awaiting word of triumph, was bitterly disappointed. But he did not surrender. He began planning a new crusade, one that would be different. A crusade led by Emperor Frederick II himself, but that, as they say, is another story. The Fifth Crusade, a tale of blood and ashes. In the years leading up to the Fifth Crusade, Europe was shrouded in the darkness of ignorance, poverty, and internal strife. Pope Innocent III, that elderly man with piercing eyes, sat in his papal palace in Rome, contemplating maps of the known world while his frail fingers traced imaginary lines toward the east. He knew the time had come for a decisive strike, one that would alter the course of history. This was not merely a military campaign but a holy war, a war for salvation and immortality. In the palaces of France, King Philip II tossed and turned in his bed, unable to sleep. Memories of past defeats haunted him like nightmares. In Hungary, King Andrew II was assembling a vast army of starving peasants and ambitious knights, all ready to die to wash away their sins. And in Germany, Emperor Frederick II, that cultured young man with a brilliant mind, dreamed of a different kind of crusade, one that required neither swords nor bloodshed. When the first Crusader ships arrived on the shores of Acre, the city that had once been the pearl of the Mediterranean was now a faded shadow of its former glory. Crumbling walls, nearly empty markets, and knights wandering the streets with despair in their eyes, all bore witness to the decline of the Crusader dream. But the arrival of fresh reinforcements rekindled hope among the settlers. Suddenly, the city began to breathe again. Inside the Grand Command tent, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Cardinal Pelagius, the papal legate, stood tall like a marble statue, his eyes burning with religious zeal. "Egypt," he shouted with all his might. "He who controls the Nile controls the fate of Jerusalem." It was a bold plan, one no one had dared attempt before. Some military leaders objected, recalling the disasters of previous campaigns, but the voice of reason was drowned out by the roar of religious fervor. When the Crusader sails appeared off the coast of Damietta, the tranquil city that had lived in harmony with the Nile was suddenly transformed into a battlefield. Women dragged their children indoors, merchants rushed to shutter their shops, and soldiers scrambled to their defensive positions. On the castle walls stood Sultan Al-Kamil Muhammad, the young man who had recently inherited the throne of Egypt, gazing at the foreign fleet with eyes that betrayed no fear. He knew this moment would determine his fate, and that of the entire Islamic world. The first days of the siege were an unending nightmare. The massive trebuchets built by the Crusaders hurled enormous stones at the walls, each one bringing death and destruction. The Muslim defenders responded with volleys of flaming arrows, turning the sky above the city into a hellscape of fire and smoke. At night, the Crusaders dug tunnels beneath the walls while the Muslims counterdug to intercept them. Even the earth itself had become a battleground. After months of siege, exhaustion began to show on all sides. In the Crusader camp, diseases spread due to malnutrition and contaminated water. Inside the besieged city, food ran low, and children cried from hunger. Sultan Al-Kamil sent desperate messages to Cairo, pleading for reinforcements, but the roads were blocked, and death awaited every messenger at the city gates. On one unusually dark night, Al-Kamil led a surprise attack. His men moved like shadows through the trenches, their swords gripped tightly, their hearts pounding with fear and hope. But the moon suddenly emerged from behind the clouds, revealing their movements. What followed was a horrific slaughter. The screams of the wounded pierced the night, and the blood of martyrs stained the Nile red. When Damietta finally fell, the victory was bitter for the invaders. The city they entered resembled a vast graveyard. Scattered corpses in the streets, burned out houses, and the stench of decay in the air, all served as reminders of the cost of conquest. Even the most hardened soldiers were sickened by what they saw. Cardinal Pelagius, who had been shouting orders from afar, dared not enter the city until days later, when his men had begun clearing the streets of bodies. The winter that followed was unprecedentedly harsh. Torrential rains turned the Crusader camp into a vast swamp. Tents sank into the mud, supplies rotted, and diseases ravaged the soldiers. Some commanders began questioning the point of staying, but Cardinal Pelagius remained determined to march on Cairo. "God is with us," he screamed at the doubters. "Those who falter now are traitors to the faith." But the Nile, that ancient god who had witnessed countless civilizations, had a deadly surprise in store. As the Crusaders began their march south, Al-Kamil opened the floodgates. The raging waters became a monstrous beast, swallowing everything in their path. Horses drowned in the current, wagons sank into the mud, and men begged for salvation as the waters rose around them. On that fateful night, as the Crusaders tried to sleep in their flooded tents, they heard strange sounds emerging from the darkness. Suddenly, Islamic forces ambushed them from all sides. Swords gleaming in the moonlight, battle cries, the smell of blood and dampness, all merged into a blood-soaked nightmare. Cardinal Pelagius, once so arrogant and domineering, found himself kneeling in the mud, tears streaming down his face, begging for mercy. By dawn, it was all over. The Crusader leaders signed a humiliating surrender. They were to leave Egypt immediately, abandoning Damietta after all their sacrifices. As they boarded their ships to return home, their gazes were empty, their hearts broken, their dreams buried in the desert sands. They were no longer the same men who had sailed from Europe years before. War had changed them, as it changes all who taste its bitterness. In Cairo, the people celebrated their victory. The streets buzzed with joy, bells rang, and children danced. But Sultan Al-Kamil, standing on his palace balcony watching the Crusader ships disappear over the horizon, did not share in the revelry. His eyes looked toward the future with worry. He knew this was not the end but the beginning of a longer struggle. History teaches us that wars never truly end, they only take new forms. Back in Europe, when news of the defeat arrived, a heavy silence fell over palaces and councils. The new Pope, Gregory IX, successor to Honorius III, sat in his dimly lit study, contemplating the same maps his predecessor had studied. His aged fingers traced new lines toward the east. The Crusader dream was not dead, it merely awaited revival, and so, the Fifth Crusade became just another chapter in the eternal saga of conflict between East and West. Damietta, washed clean of invaders' blood by the Nile, the Crusaders, whose descendants would be buried in later wars, and Sultan Al-Kamil, whose name was etched into the annals of heroes, all became part of history's unending memory. But the lessons of that crusade remained alive, that religious and political greed brings only ruin and that the Holy Land yields itself only to those who truly respect its sanctity. During that tumultuous era of conflict, the Nile River stood as a silent witness to one of history's greatest military epics. Its calm blue waters were not merely a natural landmark, but transformed into both a living defensive trench and a merciless opponent for the invading Crusaders. This mighty river proved to be not just a source of life, but could become an instrument of death when necessity demanded. As the siege began, the Nile revealed its dual nature. Its branching channels around Damietta formed a watery labyrinth that frustrated the advance of heavy Crusader warships. The massive sailing vessels that terrorized open seas found themselves helpless against the shifting currents and narrow passages, while the nimble Islamic boats, specifically designed for river navigation, maneuvered with shark-like precision around their confused prey. With the flood season's arrival, the Nile changed its strategy. The gently flowing waters became a moving hell. Rushing currents began swallowing everything in their path: trenches, barricades, even military equipment. Crusader soldiers accustomed to fighting visible enemies found themselves battling a relentless, invisible foe. The infiltrating waters penetrated their camps at night, leaving behind lakes of despair and disease. The Muslim military engineers, drawing on centuries of accumulated experience coexisting with the Nile, weaponized the flood. An intricate network of secondary channels and dams was manipulated with precision to direct water toward Crusader positions. This was no random act, but a calculated attack where every drop of water became a soldier in an invisible army. The results were horrifying. Crusader ranks began collapsing not before enemy swords, but before nature's blind force. Waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery spread like wildfire. Food supplies rotted, weapons rusted, and morale disintegrated. Even the most steadfast commanders began doubting their wisdom in challenging this great river. When the Crusaders finally attempted retreat, they found the Nile had closed all escape routes. The land paths they came by were submerged, transformed into vast swamps. Attempts to flee along the river itself proved suicidal as the strong currents swept away any who dared challenge them. In the end, the Nile recorded its silent victory. Without battle clamor or clashing swords, it succeeded in defeating one of that era's mightiest armies. It proved that true power doesn't always lie in weapons and numbers, but in deep understanding of the land and its potential. This unique battle left an eternal lesson, that geography can be a stronger ally than any army, and that rivers may be greater military commanders than any general. In the early 13th century AD, as Europe navigated its way through the conflicts of kings and barons, the cries of holy war once again echoed from Rome. The Fifth Crusade, that bold adventure targeting the heart of the Islamic world in Egypt, witnessed a series of military confrontations that altered the course of history. On the banks of the Great Nile, where the waters of the Mediterranean meet fertile soil, lies the fortified city of Damietta. Here began the first of the great battles, as the Crusaders besieged the city for over 17 months. This was no ordinary siege, but a masterpiece of medieval warfare. The Crusaders, led by Cardinal Pelagius, constructed a massive floating wooden tower, towering like mountains, equipped with movable bridges and observation decks. From atop this tower, they rained down upon the Muslim defenders a barrage of arrows and Greek fire. Yet Damietta was no easy prize. Sultan Al-Kamil Muhammad, that young leader who had recently inherited the Egyptian throne, managed the defense with astonishing skill. A fleet of swift, small yet deadly boats maneuvered around the heavy Crusader ships like wolves circling prey. On dark nights, the Mujahideen launched lightning raids before disappearing into the maze of waterways. Greek fire, that secret weapon invented by the Byzantines, set Crusader sails ablaze, turning them into floating torches. With the arrival of winter, the battle took a new turn. The Nile's waters, calm as a mirror in summer, transformed into a ferocious beast. The annual flood, eagerly awaited by farmers, became the invaders' nightmare. Trenches filled with water, equipment sank into mud, and soldiers began wasting away from hunger and disease. In Cairo, Al-Kamil watched these developments with an expert eye, preparing for a decisive strike. The Battle of Mansurah in August 1221 marked the tragic end of the campaign. Here, at Ashmantana, where the Nile branches into its delta, the Muslims executed a brilliant strategy. Military engineers opened secondary floodgates at precisely calculated times. The raging waters became an invincible army, sweeping through Crusader camps and turning them into isolated islands in a sea of mud. Warhorses, the pride of European armies, became stuck in swamps, their neighing growing hoarse. Supply wagons laden with spoils sank slowly, like shattered ships to the ocean depths. The outcome proved catastrophic for the Crusaders. Over 80% of their military equipment was lost beneath the waters. Diseases, especially cholera and dysentery, spread like wildfire. Soldiers who had arrived in fine uniforms with gleaming swords were reduced to gaunt specters, their eyes sunken, their bodies covered in sores. In the end, they had no choice but to surrender. They raised white flags, abandoned Damietta, which had cost them thousands of lives, and returned to their ships in defeat. These battles were more than mere military confrontations, they were lessons in the art of war and strategy. The Crusaders learned, albeit too late, that Egypt was unlike other lands. The Nile, that vital artery, was more than just a river, it was the valley's faithful guardian. And Sultan Al-Kamil proved that military genius isn't measured by troop numbers, but by a commander's ability to turn every environmental element into a weapon. In European palaces, news of the defeat was met with heavy silence. The campaign that had cost vast fortunes and countless lives ended without achieving any of its objectives. But in Cairo, the lessons learned were different. The Muslims realized that victory's key lies not just in military might, but in deep understanding of the land and its fluctuations. The Nile, with its floods and calm, its channels and marshes, proved the finest ally for those who knew how to wield it. The Nile's floodwaters wrote an immortal page in military history's annals, transforming from mere river to supreme commander, from water source to strategic weapon. These lessons remain etched in generational memory, forever reminding us that when land fights alongside its loyal children, it becomes mightier than any invading army. When the war drums announced the arrival of the Fifth Crusade, Sultan Al-Adil Ayyubi sat in his Cairo palace like an old eagle sensing the storm before it breaks. News of the Crusaders gathering in Acre reached him through his network of spies spread across every port. He immediately began preparing for what he knew might be the final battle of his life. In the war room of the palace, Al-Adil pounded his hand on the leather map of Egypt, shouting to his commanders, "Damietta. Damietta is the key." Understanding this coastal city would be the Crusaders' primary target, he transformed it into what resembled a floating fortress. He ordered the construction of an underwater defensive chain made of ropes with iron rings, each the size of a dinner plate, requiring 50 strong men to move it. This defensive invention wasn't just a barrier but an elaborate trap for enemy ships. In the following weeks, Damietta became a model of comprehensive military fortification. Al-Adil commanded the construction of mobile wooden barricades coated with tar that could be deployed within hours at any river point. He established an early warning system consisting of a series of towers stretching from the coast to Cairo, each equipped with mirrors for sending light signals day and night. But Al-Adil was more than just a military leader, he was a brilliant strategist. He understood wars aren't won by swords alone. He sent spies to the Crusader camps in Acre with orders to spread rumors and sow discord among their leaders. Simultaneously, he formed alliances with Bedouin tribes in Sinai, promising generous rewards for attacking Crusader supply lines should they advance. In Cairo, Al-Adil personally supervised the training of special units of night fighters specializing in psychological warfare. These warriors would infiltrate enemy camps at night, making strange noises to spread panic and painting mysterious symbols on Crusader commanders' tents to terrify them. As the Crusader fleet approached Egyptian shores, Al-Adil implemented the boldest part of his plan. He ordered the burning of all crops within a 50-mile radius of Damietta. Flames consumed field after field while farmers wept over their livelihoods. But Al-Adil knew this sacrifice was necessary. "Hunger will be our secret weapon," he said as he watched black smoke clouds cover the horizon. In the final days before battle, Al-Adil felt the weight of his years. His men carried him on a special chair to inspect preparations as he could no longer walk long distances. During one inspection tour, he stood on Damietta's walls watching the calm Nile and uttered his famous words recorded by history, "These waters that irrigate our land will become a drawn sword against our enemies' necks." But time ran out for Al-Adil. On a sweltering August night, he contracted a mysterious fever. Despite his condition, he refused rest and continued issuing orders from his sickbed. In his final moments, he gathered his sons and commanders, leaving them 3 instructions: don't concede an inch of land, use the Nile as your ally, and remember that clever negotiations may achieve what 10,000 swords cannot. After Al-Adil's death, his son Al-Kamil carried the torch of resistance, discovering his father had left all necessary tools for victory. The fortifications he built, the spy networks he established, and the meticulous strategies he devised all bore fruit eventually. Even the idea of using the Nile flood as a weapon, later implemented at the Battle of Mansoura, originated from Al-Adil's brilliant mind. History proved Al-Adil's strategic vision was far more profound than mere military reaction. He transformed all of Egypt into a massive trap awaiting the Crusaders, making geography and nature his allies. Even his death didn't stop his plan but became part of it, as men's determination draws strength from the legacy of great predecessors. Historical background: in the early 13th century AD, Europe was undergoing profound political, economic, and religious transformations. Italian cities were experiencing an unprecedented commercial renaissance that drove their search for new markets and alternative global trade routes. The Crusades presented these cities with a golden opportunity to expand beyond their Mediterranean confines. Venice had emerged as a major naval power following the Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204, seizing strategic islands and ports in the Aegean. Yet Venetian merchants kept looking eastward toward the true sources of wealth: spices, silks, and precious stones flowing through Muslim-controlled trade routes. Genoa, Venice's fierce competitor, possessed the largest merchant fleet in Western Europe but faced intense rivalry. The Fifth Crusade offered Genoa a chance to secure Levantine footholds and recover from previous losses against its rivals. Pisa, though smaller, was at its commercial peak, with ships reaching distant eastern and western ports. The Crusade represented Pisa's opportunity to establish permanent colonial trading posts along the eastern Mediterranean coastline. Commercial interests: the Italian maritime republics pursued distinct economic agendas through the Fifth Crusade. Venice sought to dominate the spice trade routes through Egypt and Syria, the lifeline of European economy. Venetian archives show spice trade profits sometimes reached 300%. The city also aimed to weaken Genoese competitors and establish itself as the exclusive east-west intermediary. Genoa committed 85 warships to transport Crusaders in exchange for future commercial privileges. Notarial records reveal Genoa had pre-drafted contracts guaranteeing substantial shares of any conquered territories. Pisa focused on infrastructure, with engineers preparing detailed plans to transform captured ports like Damietta into fortified commercial hubs, complete with warehouses, markets, and administrative buildings. All three cities shared the goal of breaking Muslim and Arab monopolies on eastern trade routes to avoid heavy customs duties imposed on European merchants. Execution and maneuvers. Preparations exposed deep rivalries. Venice demanded leadership given its naval supremacy, which Genoa strongly opposed. Financing came from three sources: papal funds, noble contributions, and Italian merchant investments in exchange for future privileges. Venice spent 50,000 gold ducats just to equip its fleet. Genoa conditioned its 85 warships on first rights to select trading posts after victory. Pisa specialized in logistics, sending engineers and construction materials. During the Crusade, 1217 to 1221, Italian infighting often overshadowed military operations. Spy reports mention Venetian ships deliberately delaying troop transports to secure private deals with local rulers. Genoese merchants allegedly bribed Crusader commanders to steer campaigns toward commercially favorable targets. Outcomes and repercussions. Despite military failure, Italian cities secured significant advantages. Venice gained additional trade privileges in Acre and Tyre, increasing its Levantine commerce by 30% within 5 years. Genoa obtained secret safe passage agreements with Muslim rulers. Pisa won lucrative construction contracts in Syrian ports. The Crusade stimulated major financial innovations: early forms of campaign bonds traded in Italian markets, and embryonic marine insurance systems, 2 to 5% premiums. These developments laid foundations for modern capitalism. Politically, the events shifted Mediterranean power dynamics in favor of Italian city-states over traditional empires. The Crusade demonstrated how economic interests often drove holy wars more than religious motives. Hidden alliances and internal conflicts. The Crusade revealed complex, shifting alliances. Venice and Genoa, historic rivals, formed an uneasy coalition under papal pressure. Archive documents show their representatives physically fought over prime commercial spaces in besieged Damietta before its capture. Pisa cultivated separate alliances with German Crusaders, promising exclusive trade privileges in conquered territories, causing constant friction with Venice and Genoa. The papacy attempted to mediate while advancing its own interests through legates in the Crusader army. Logistics and financing. The Crusade's enormous costs spurred financial innovations. Genoa's bank records show merchant Giovanni da Scali issued 5,000 gold-pound bonds yielding 20% upon campaign success. Early examples of military financing. Venice developed primitive marine insurance, 2 to 5% premiums depending on risk. Supply ships used circular routes and secret signals to avoid Muslim naval interception. Cultural and intellectual impact. Despite its military nature, the crusade facilitated cultural exchange. Florentine manuscripts contain detailed descriptions of Egyptian agricultural techniques brought back by Italian soldiers. Some of the earliest Latin translations of Arabic medical and engineering texts entered Europe via crusade participants. Intellectually, the expedition deepened European debates about relations with the Muslim world, between confrontational approaches and more open commercial/cultural engagement. Historical legacy. The Fifth Crusade left a complex legacy. Militarily, a crusader disaster. Commercially, launched Italian dominance of Mediterranean trade. Financially, pioneered instruments like bonds and insurance that shaped modern capitalism. The campaign remains a powerful historical case study of how religion, politics, and economics intersect to shape major historical events, with commercial interests often being the hidden driving force behind holy wars. In that scorching summer of 1218, thousands of crusaders stood on the eastern banks of the Nile, staring in awe at the formidable barrier preventing their advance toward Damietta. The massive iron chain constructed by Egyptian engineers stretched across the river like a giant metallic serpent, connecting the impregnable chain tower on the eastern shore with an equally formidable western fortress. Each link of this chain, forged from solid iron and as wide as a dinner plate, presented an unprecedented challenge to even the mightiest naval forces of that era. Within the Crusader camp, commanders gathered in a large tent strewn with engineering manuscripts and diagrams. They understood that breaching these defenses would require more than conventional military bravery. After days of heated debate, they devised an audacious plan relying on technological innovation, the construction of two unprecedented war machines, a massive floating siege tower they called the Marvel, and a specialized chain-breaking ship equipped with a hydraulic hammer operated by an intricate system of pulleys and counterweights. Hundreds of Crusader carpenters and blacksmiths worked tirelessly to assemble these machines from prefabricated components brought from Europe. The Marvel stood as a true engineering masterpiece, a 5-story wooden tower mounted on twin floating platforms, featuring 4 movable bridges that could be deployed in any direction. The chain-breaking ship proved even more remarkable, with a German engineer's complex system of weights and levers capable of generating several tons of striking force. At dawn on August 24, the battle commenced with intense artillery bombardment from Crusader ships. The floating tower advanced slowly toward the chain tower while the specialized vessel attacked the western anchor point. Egyptian defenders rained down burning arrows and petroleum bombs upon the attackers. Thick smoke engulfed the battlefield as the clang of metal mingled with war cries and screams of pain. The brutal fighting raged for 3 full days. Inside the floating tower, Crusaders fought room to room against extraordinarily valiant Egyptian defenders. Meanwhile, the chain-breaking ship endured repeated attacks from fireboats. Yet the massive hydraulic hammer continued its relentless work, striking the chain with rhythmic blows resembling the ticking of some colossal clock. On the 3rd day, the unexpected occurred. One tremendous hammer blow struck a critical weak point in the chain, causing it to snap with an earth-shaking report heard miles away. Nearly simultaneously, Crusaders secured the upper levels of the chain tower. Victory was theirs, but at terrible cost. Approximately 1,200 Crusader dead against 700 Egyptian defenders. Ironically, this spectacular military triumph failed to achieve the decisive result the Crusaders hoped for. Internal disputes among their leaders and supply shortages delayed their advance toward Damietta for months, giving Sultan Al-Kamil crucial time to reinforce the city's defenses. From a military perspective, the battle demonstrated unprecedented advancement in naval siege technology. The coordinated combination of artillery bombardment, sophisticated engineering, and amphibious assault set new standards for medieval naval warfare, while revealing that even the most advanced defensive systems could possess fatal vulnerabilities. In the broader historical context, the Battle of the Chain Tower became a classic case study in military academies. Similar chain defenses later appeared at Constantinople and other European cities. The eyewitness account by Oliver of Paderborn remains an invaluable document for understanding 13th-century military technological evolution. The Siege of Damietta, an epic of endurance and attrition in the harsh winter of November 1218. The coastal city of Damietta became the stage for a monumental battle between Crusader forces led by Jean de Brienne and the Ayyubid army under Sultan Al-Kamil Muhammad. This bitter siege lasted 17 grueling months, witnessing some of the fiercest fighting in Crusades history. Sultan Al-Kamil, fully aware of the impending danger, transformed the city into an impregnable fortress within months. He engineered an intricate network of water-filled trenches around the walls reaching 4 meters deep, constructed 36 observation towers equipped with platforms for launching Greek fire, and stockpiled provisions sufficient for a full year's siege, including wheat, olives, and dried meats. His preparations extended beyond visible fortifications, with a secret tunnel system connecting different city sectors allowing covert troop movements and supply transfers unseen by enemies. Special night fighting units trained in guerrilla warfare completed his defensive measures. The Crusaders arrived with unprecedented military preparations. Their fleet of 80 warships included vessels carrying massive trebuchets capable of launching 200-kilogram stones over remarkable distances. They constructed 12 mobile siege towers standing 15 meters tall, while their field hospital, a medical marvel of its time, could accommodate 500 wounded with European doctors equipped with advanced surgical tools and rare medicines. The siege progressed through 3 distinct phases. The naval blockade saw daily sea battles from dawn till dusk, costing the Crusaders 22 ships, some destroyed by Greek fire poured from the ramparts. The land assault phase featured 5 failed attempts to breach the walls using siege towers, each met with desperate resistance as defenders showered the wooden structures with fire arrows. The psychological warfare phase saw relentless trebuchet bombardment while Crusaders attempted to poison water supplies with animal carcasses, countered by Egyptian night raids where stealth fighters slaughtered sentries before vanishing into darkness. Both sides faced catastrophic crises. After 10 months, Damietta's starving residents resorted to eating roots and leather, while plague ravaged the Crusader camp claiming thousands. The Nile's sudden summer flood in 1219 submerged large portions of the Crusader position, creating disease-ridden swamps. The human cost proved horrifying: 15,000 Crusader dead against 8,000 Egyptian military and civilian casualties. 60% of the city's structures lay in ruins, including historic mosques and marketplaces. When Damietta finally fell in November 1219, it stood as a ghost city of shattered walls and corpse-lined streets. Yet this Pyrrhic victory marked the Crusaders' beginning of the end. Their forces so depleted it set the stage for their eventual crushing defeat at Mansoura. Militarily, the siege of Damietta revolutionized medieval warfare concepts, becoming the new standard for advanced preparation, sophisticated fortification, and attritional combat. Historical accounts reveal how the battle became a masterclass in endurance and sacrifice, its lessons echoing through subsequent siege warfare for generations. The confrontation demonstrated how even the most determined attackers could be broken by well-prepared defenses and strategic patience, while simultaneously showing the terrible human cost of such prolonged sieges on both defenders and attackers alike. The Battle of Ferrascour, the catastrophic end of the Fifth Crusade in the scorching August of 1221, as Crusader forces confidently advanced toward Cairo following their prolonged occupation of Damietta, Sultan Al-Kamil's troops were strategically withdrawing before them, leaving behind a land devoid of supplies and water. The brilliant Sultan had spent months studying detailed maps of the Nile's floods, currents and subsidiary canals. The Egyptian plan aimed to transform the land between Damietta and Mansoura into a deadly trap. As the annual flood season approached, Al-Kamil's military engineers secretly opened dozens of subsidiary canals and small dams, deliberately accelerating and intensifying the flood in carefully selected areas. When the Crusaders reached the plains of Ferrascour, they suddenly found themselves surrounded by rapidly rising waters. Their heavy horses and equipment-laden carts began sinking into mud that had turned into deep swamps. Egyptian arrows rained down on them from 3 directions while Muslim cavalry blocked their retreat. Crusader chronicler Oliver Potterborn, who witnessed the battle, wrote in his memoirs that the waters rose with terrifying speed. Within hours, the solid ground where they had pitched their tents at night became a waterlogged lake by noon. Soldiers attempting to flee faced either drowning in the rising waters or deadly arrows. The massacre continued for 5 consecutive days. On the first day, most horses and heavy equipment drowned. On the second day, diseases began spreading among Crusaders trapped in stagnant waters. By the third day, the Crusader camp had become a horrific scene of floating corpses and scattered weapons. Sultan Al-Kamil demonstrated brilliant battlefield management, dividing his forces into small mobile units using light boats to maneuver through flooded areas while the Crusaders remained immobilized. He ordered his troops to spare noble prisoners for lucrative ransoms. Ultimately, the Crusaders were forced to sign a humiliating surrender document with harsh terms: immediate evacuation of Damietta, destruction of its fortifications, payment of a large ransom, and return of all Muslim prisoners. They also had to abandon all their heavy equipment and weapons. This crushing defeat ended Crusader dreams of conquering Egypt via the Nile for centuries to come. It proved that precise knowledge of geography and climate could be more powerful than any army, while establishing Sultan Al-Kamil's formidable reputation throughout the Islamic world as the most powerful ruler of his time. In the scorching summer of 1221, as the overconfident Crusader forces advanced toward Cairo, the mighty Nile was preparing a deadly trap for them. The Crusader commanders ignored all signs and warnings about the approaching flood season, believing their military might alone would guarantee victory. Little did they realize they were facing a more cunning and formidable enemy, nature itself. For centuries, the Egyptians had meticulously studied the Nile's flooding patterns, developing an astonishingly precise predictive capability. While the Crusaders relied on traditional European tactics, Sultan Al-Kamil's military engineers were transforming the land itself into a weapon. They secretly dug canals and prepared dam gates that could be opened at the decisive moment, turning the plains into vast lakes that isolated Crusader units from each other. As the Nile's waters began rising, the Crusaders' primary weapons, their heavily armored knights, became fatal liabilities. Every movement required exhausting effort, while Egyptian fighters moved swiftly in their light boats, leveraging their knowledge of water currents and depths. Even the famous longbows that had given Crusaders superiority in previous battles became useless in this aquatic environment. The Crusader logistics system, designed for European land campaigns, collapsed completely. Supplies sunk in mud, weapons malfunctioned from humidity, and diseases spread rapidly among soldiers trapped in stagnant waters, all combining to transform this ambitious campaign into an endless nightmare. The bitterest irony? Sultan Al-Kamil had actually sent the Crusaders advance warnings about the flood timing, possibly as psychological warfare. But the Crusader leaders' arrogance and religious zeal blinded them to these signals, convinced that God's will must inevitably favor them. This military catastrophe was more than just a lost battle, it was a harsh lesson in the critical importance of understanding local environments in strategic planning. It proved that knowledge could be a more powerful weapon than swords, and that the land itself could become an invincible ally for those who knew its secrets. The Nile's waters didn't just defeat an army, they humbled an empire's arrogance through nature's immutable laws. Cardinal Pelagius played a pivotal role in determining the fate of the Fifth Crusade through a series of controversial decisions marked by religious fanaticism and ideological rigidity that overrode all military and strategic considerations. As the absolute papal legate of Honorius III, he wielded supreme authority that enabled him to override experienced military commanders, insisting on catastrophic decisions against expert military advice. In 1220, Pelagius arrogantly rejected Sultan Al-Kamil's generous peace offer that would have restored Jerusalem to Christian control without further fighting, along with the return of the True Cross and a 30-year truce. His obstinate refusal stemmed from viewing any negotiation with Muslims as a betrayal of Christianity, demonstrating how religious dogma blinded him to strategic opportunities. The cardinal stubbornly insisted on advancing toward Cairo despite repeated warnings about the imminent Nile flood, dismissing reports from advisors and the counsel of King John of Brienne, who better understood local conditions. His disastrous timing placed the Crusader army directly in the flood's path when they could have waited mere weeks for safer conditions. Pelagius squandered 18 critical months during the siege of Damietta without developing any coherent strategy for exploiting this victory, leaving the occupied city stagnant for 2 years without meaningful strategic advancement. When he finally ordered the march inland, he chose the absolute worst possible moment at the flood season's peak. During the Battle of Mansurah, his military leadership collapsed into complete chaos as Crusader forces found themselves trapped between rising Nile waters and Muslim attacks. Pelagius proved utterly incapable of sound decision-making, resulting in catastrophic losses of both lives and equipment that crippled the campaign. Ultimately, Pelagius was forced to sign a humiliating surrender agreement in August 1221, relinquishing all Crusader gains from 3 years of fighting. The terms required evacuating Damietta after personally destroying its fortifications, surrendering all military equipment, and paying substantial ransom to Sultan Al-Kamil, a total strategic defeat. Historians remember Pelagius as the archetype of failed religious leadership, whose dogmatic rigidity and military incompetence created an unbridgeable gap between idealistic religious visions and battlefield realities. His interference and dismissal of professional military judgment transformed potential victory into historical catastrophe, converting golden opportunities into crushing defeats through his fanaticism and inflexibility. Contemporary chronicler Oliver of Paderborn summarized Pelagius' leadership as a toxic mixture of religious arrogance and military ignorance, while Muslim forces viewed him as a divine gift for undermining the crusade from within. In the spring of 1218, as the Crusader ships approached the Egyptian coast, Jean de Brienne stood on the deck of his vessel gazing thoughtfully at the horizon. This battle-hardened French knight, who nominally bore the title King of Jerusalem, understood that the real battle would not only be against the Ayyubid forces but also against the arrogance and fanaticism within the Crusaders' own ranks. Brienne's blue eyes reflected concern as he observed the soldiers' excessive enthusiasm, knowing full well that victory couldn't be achieved by bravery alone. Having spent years in the East, he had learned harsh lessons about the importance of understanding the land and its people. In his tent at night, he carefully drafted his plans, drawing upon his extensive knowledge of the Levant gained through previous campaigns. When they reached Damietta, Brienne immediately clashed with Cardinal Pelagius. While Pelagius insisted on the complete conquest of Egypt, Brienne believed controlling the coastal city would suffice to achieve their objectives. Damietta is the key, he would tell his commanders, with it we can open negotiations without risking thousands of soldiers' lives. On a sweltering summer day in 1219, as Brienne inspected the city's fortifications, a messenger arrived bearing an offer from Sultan Al-Kamil. The terms were generous: Jerusalem, the true cross, a lengthy truce. Brienne's eyes lit up as he read the document. Here was an opportunity to end the suffering and achieve their goals without further bloodshed. But Cardinal Pelagius arrogantly rejected the offer, considering negotiation with infidels a sin. Brienne, with his characteristic composure, tried to reason, it's not betrayal, but wisdom. Yet the voice of reason was drowned out by the cries of fanatics who wanted total victory or death. As the flood season approached, Brienne grew increasingly anxious. He knew the Nile's waters would turn the land into a deadly trap. At the commander's meeting, he warned, we must wait, or at least prepare emergency boats. But no one listened. Even his own soldiers began doubting his judgment, swayed by Pelagius' fiery speeches. When the waters began to rise, Brienne's predictions became a living nightmare. He watched helplessly as the plains transformed into lakes, as carts and equipment sank into the mud. His soldiers begged him for salvation, but he knew it was too late. In those moments, he felt more powerless than ever before. After the disaster, Brienne himself was forced to sign the humiliating surrender document. His hands trembled as he signed, not from fear, but from anger at knowing all this could have been avoided. During the return voyage to Europe, he spent long hours alone on deck, staring at the sea and wondering, how much blood could have been spared had they listened to reason. Ironically, Sultan Al-Kamil himself showed great respect for Brienne after the battle. He once told his advisors that Frenchman was the only one who truly understood the game. Some sources even mention that Al-Kamil sent Brienne a personal gift after the campaign ended, as a token of respect between warriors. Brienne's strategy, though ultimately unsuccessful, remains a model of rational leadership amid religious and military conflicts. It proved that deep understanding of geography, politics, and local culture is no less important than military might. The lessons of this experience still resonate today in military academies, serving as a warning against letting religious or political passions override strategic judgment. Damietta facing the storm, a historical narrative of the Fifth Crusade. The cold autumn winds howled against the mighty walls of Damietta when the first sails of the Crusader ships appeared on the horizon, like phantoms emerging from another world to alter the course of history. Those tense moments before the storm were the most critical in the coastal city's history, as guards stood atop the towering ramparts, staring at the Mediterranean Sea, once an ally, now turned enemy. In the Sultan's palace in Cairo, Al-Kamil Muhammad ibn Adil received continuous reports of the Crusaders' movements, his eyes never leaving the map spread across the marble table. He knew Damietta was not just another coastal city, it was Egypt's northern gateway, the key that, if seized, would open the path to the heart of the Islamic world. He sent urgent orders to the garrison commanders to hold firm while preparing for a decisive battle that could shape the region's fate for decades to come. Across the sea, the Crusaders had meticulously completed their preparations. They carried not only swords and shields but also dreams of restoring the fading glory of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. They believed that striking Egypt at its core would be the fatal blow to Islamic power in the region. They planned carefully, amassed vast resources, and summoned knights from across Europe, yet they overlooked one crucial fact: Damietta was not just a dot on the map. The siege began under harsh conditions for both sides. The towering walls of Damietta, fortified by the Ayyubids with great care, withstood the initial waves of attack. Defenders rained flaming arrows upon the assailants as the Crusaders repeatedly attempted to scale the walls with wooden ladders, only to be met with boiling oil and crushing stones. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the besieged city began to feel the strain. Supplies dwindled, disease spread, yet the defenders' morale remained high, bolstered by preachers who reminded them of their ancestors' heroic stands in defending Muslim frontiers. Meanwhile, the Crusader camp faced its own internal struggles, as commanders disagreed on strategy, and disease ravaged soldiers unaccustomed to the delta's humid climate. Winter came and went, followed by spring, yet Damietta held firm. But on a scorching summer day, the Crusaders finally breached a weak point in the walls after relentless assaults. The invaders poured into the city amid fierce resistance from its people, committing horrific massacres in the neighborhoods that fought back. Damietta fell at last, and the Crusader cross was raised atop its highest tower, while those defenders who could escape carried news of the city's fall to Cairo. In the royal court, the news struck like a thunderbolt. Sultan Al-Kamil made a historic offer, Jerusalem itself in exchange for Damietta. But the Crusader leaders, drunk on victory, refused, believing they could conquer all of Egypt. That decision marked the beginning of their downfall. As the seasons changed, the Egyptian strategy bore fruit. Muslim forces cut off supply lines and maneuvered through the delta, encircling the Crusaders from all sides. When the Nile flooded, the land around Damietta turned into vast swamps, trapping the invaders in a natural death trap. Disease and starvation ravaged the Crusader camp, while Muslim forces tightened the noose day by day. In the end, the Crusaders had no choice but to surrender. They left Damietta in defeat, leaving behind thousands of dead and shattered dreams. The city, which had sacrificed so much for freedom, finally returned to Ayyubid rule, but at a heavy cost. Neighborhoods lay in ruins, families were torn apart, and the economy suffered for years. These events were not just a chapter in a history book. They were a stark lesson for any who dared attack Muslim strongholds. Damietta taught the world that cities are not merely stones and walls but the will of the people who build and defend them. And when the Crusaders returned decades later under Louis IX, they found the lesson unchanged. Egypt, with Damietta and its people, was, and always would be, an impregnable fortress. The Fifth Crusade, between leaders' strategies and conquerors' dreams in the early 13th century, as Europe still reeled from internal conflicts and the struggles between the papacy and the empire, the idea of reclaiming the Holy Land once again came to the forefront. The Fifth Crusade was not just another military adventure, it was a calculated, though ultimately unsuccessful, attempt to strike at the heart of the Islamic world, represented by Egypt, the seat of Ayyubid power that ruled Jerusalem at the time. This crusade was the product of intertwined religious, political, and military efforts, led by men who believed victory was assured, only to collide with the harsh realities of geography, climate, and politics they had failed to properly consider. The call to crusade. The Pope and the Ecclesiastical Council. In 1215, members of the Catholic Church gathered at the Fourth Lateran Council, convened by Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful popes of the Middle Ages. The stated goal was to reform the Church and regulate its affairs, but among the decrees issued was an explicit call for a new crusade. Innocent III was not a man content with appearances. He wanted an organized campaign, backed by sufficient resources, distinct from previous crusades that had often devolved into chaotic marches. But fate did not grant Innocent III the chance to see his crusade realized. He died in 1216, leaving the task of overseeing the campaign to his successor, Pope Honorius III. Yet the momentum Innocent had set in motion remained strong, as preachers spread throughout Europe, urging princes, knights, and commoners to take up the cross. Among these preachers was Jacques de Vitry, who later became the Bishop of Acre, a charismatic orator who could ignite fervor in the hearts of many. The new target Egypt instead of Jerusalem. Unlike previous crusades that focused on direct assaults on Jerusalem, the leaders of the Fifth Crusade decided that the key to victory lay in Egypt. Ruled by the Ayyubid Sultan Al-Kamil Muhammad ibn al-Adil, Egypt represented the economic and military backbone of the Ayyubid state. If Egypt fell, Jerusalem would be an easy prize, but this decision was not made by chance. The Fourth Crusade had previously attempted to reach Egypt before diverting to Constantinople and sacking it. This time, the leaders sought to avoid such detours, and Damietta, the Egyptian city on the Nile Delta, became the primary target. Arrival in the east and the siege of Damietta in 1217, Crusader forces began gathering in Acre, but the actual advance toward Egypt was delayed until the following year. When the Crusaders reached Damietta, they found the city heavily fortified, guarded by towering towers and a massive iron chain blocking the harbor entrance. Yet the Crusaders were not lacking in perseverance. After a prolonged siege and bloody battles, they managed to destroy the iron chain and breach the defenses, capturing Damietta in 1219. This victory was a decisive moment, but it also marked the beginning of the end. Internal conflicts and catastrophic decisions. With Damietta fallen, the Crusaders were divided over their next move. On one side was Cardinal Pelagius, the papal legate, who insisted on advancing toward Cairo, believing the Ayyubids were on the verge of collapse. On the other side were military leaders like John of Brienne, the nominal king of Jerusalem, who preferred negotiation or consolidating their positions rather than risking an advance into unknown territory. But Pelagius, with his religious authority, imposed his will. The Crusader army marched south along the Nile, unaware of the dangers awaiting them. Disaster: the Nile flood and disease. As the Crusaders advanced, nature turned against them. The Nile flood, which they had failed to account for, swept away their camps and submerged roads. Diseases spread among the soldiers, unaccustomed to Egypt's humid and hot climate. Meanwhile, Sultan Al-Kamil was reorganizing his forces. When the Crusaders reached the outskirts of Al-Mansurah, they found themselves trapped between the Muslim army and the waters of the Nile. Their only option was to negotiate a retreat. The withdrawal and final failure in 1221, the Crusaders left Egypt, having lost Damietta and thousands of men without achieving any gains. The Fifth Crusade was a disastrous failure, not due to a lack of courage, but because of poor planning and underestimating both their enemy and the land itself. Legacy: a lesson unlearned. Despite its failure, the Fifth Crusade marked a shift in Crusader strategy, with Egypt becoming the primary target for subsequent campaigns, such as Louis IX's Crusade, the Seventh Crusade. Yet the most crucial lesson, the necessity of understanding geography, climate, and the enemy, was not properly learned, as later crusades would prove. Thus, the Fifth Crusade remains a tragic episode in the history of the Crusades, where the dreams of conquerors shattered against the rocks of reality. Expanded version: without numbering. In that era of the Middle Ages, as Europe staggered under feudal conflicts and papal rivalries, the Fifth Crusade emerged as a unique chapter in the centuries-long saga of holy wars. This crusade was not merely another attempt to reclaim Jerusalem, it was a strategic adventure unfolding along the banks of the Nile, where Crusader ambitions clashed with the geopolitical realities of the Islamic world. It represented a turning point in Crusader tactics, yet it also exposed deep flaws in their understanding of their enemies and the lands they sought to conquer. The political climate in Europe at the launch of the crusade was charged with tension. Pope Innocent III, that ambitious visionary who dreamed of reuniting Christendom under his authority, saw the crusade as a means to fulfill this dream. But death claimed him before he could see his project realized, leaving his successor, Honorius III, the task of leading this venture. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire was embroiled in internal strife, while France and England were preoccupied with their own disputes. This turbulent political atmosphere impacted recruitment and preparations, delaying the campaign far beyond its intended schedule. When Crusader forces finally arrived in the east, they found themselves facing a shifting Islamic alliance. The Ayyubid dynasty, ruling Egypt and Syria, was in a period of instability following the death of Sultan Al-Adil. His son, Al-Kamil, struggled to secure his rule in Egypt while his brothers vied for control of Syrian territories. This division within the Muslim ranks gave the Crusaders great hope for success, but they failed to capitalize on it effectively. They overestimated their enemy's weakness and underestimated the Muslims' ability to unite against an external threat. The siege of Damietta, which lasted for months, was an epic in itself. The Crusaders constructed massive siege towers, while the Muslim defenders innovated new methods of resistance. Among the dramatic moments of this siege was the desperate Muslim attempt to set fire to the Crusader ships using boats laden with flammable materials, only for the wind to shift at the critical moment, sparing the Crusader fleet from destruction. Such details illustrate how chance played as much a role in events as military planning. After Damietta's fall, the Crusaders faced a major strategic dilemma. Some leaders, like John of Brienne, favored consolidating control over the city and surrounding areas, while Cardinal Pelagius insisted on marching toward Cairo. This debate was not merely tactical, it reflected a deeper divide in vision. Pelagius, representing papal authority, viewed the crusade as a holy war that must continue until total victory, regardless of cost. The military leaders, however, were more pragmatic in assessing the risks. When the Crusaders finally decided to advance toward Cairo, a series of disasters befell them. The Nile flood, which they had not accounted for, turned roads into swamps, making army movement nearly impossible. Supply lines became a critical problem as the Muslims cut off their routes. In the hot, humid climate, diseases spread rapidly among the European soldiers, who had no immunity to local illnesses. The Crusader army transformed from an invading force into a mass of sick and wounded men incapable of fighting. Sultan Al-Kamil, who had initially been on the verge of losing control, skillfully exploited the Crusaders' mistakes. He lured them deep into Egyptian territory, far from their base in Damietta, then trapped them at Al-Mansurah. The Crusaders' military position became hopeless as they found themselves caught between the Muslim army and the Nile's waters. When they attempted to retreat, their withdrawal turned into a humiliating defeat under relentless attacks. Yet the story of the Fifth Crusade would not be complete without mentioning the strange episode when Francis of Assisi, founder of the Franciscan order, visited Sultan Al-Kamil's camp. This visit, in which the saint attempted to convert the Sultan, reveals another dimension of the Crusades, a clash not just of armies, but of civilizations and faiths. Francis failed in his missionary task, but the incident remains a testament to those individual attempts at communication across battle lines. When the last Crusaders left Egypt in August 1221, the campaign had left behind thousands of dead and immense material losses. More importantly, it left strategic lessons that the Crusaders failed to properly learn, as later campaigns would prove. Less than 30 years later, Louis IX of France would attempt to invade Egypt again in the Seventh Crusade, only to meet nearly the same fate. The legacy of the Fifth Crusade was complex. On one hand, it confirmed that Egypt was indeed the gateway to Jerusalem, as the Crusaders had realized. On the other, it exposed the limits of Crusader power when faced with a united Muslim front. The manner in which the Muslims reclaimed Damietta without battle, allowing the Crusaders to withdraw safely, demonstrated a level of military chivalry rare in those times. In the final analysis, the Fifth Crusade stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of military arrogance and the importance of understanding terrain and climate in warfare. It was an adventure that began with dreams of glory but ended with a harsh lesson in military humility. Today, as the pages of history turn, this crusade remains a witness to the fact that religious zeal alone is not enough to secure victory, and that war is a complex art requiring more than just fervor and faith.